The silence of the high country doesn't hit you all at once. It settles in layers, starting the moment you turn off the paved state highway and your tires hit the loose, gray gravel of the logging roads. By the time you've driven 20 miles into the back country of the Pacific Northwest, winding through timberland that was abandoned by the lumber companies 3 decades ago, the silence becomes a physical weight. David and I had been planning this trip for 6 months. We were childhood friends, the kind who didn't need to fill every empty pocket of time with small talk. David was a surveyor by trade, an analytical guy who kept a worn topographical map rolled up in the glove box, and he could look at a ridge line and tell you exactly how many feet it dropped before it hit the creek bed. I was the one who packed the heavy cast iron skillet and the extra wool blankets. We weren't survivalists, just two men in their early 30s who wanted 4 days of trout fishing and wood smoke without the glare of a single cell tower in the horizon. Our destination was a dead-end logging spur known to the old maps as Ridge Road 402. It sat on a high, narrow spine of land overlooking a deep, heavily forested basin. At the very end of the spur was a clearing, an old log landing site from the 1970s that has since grown over with wild blackberry briars and fireweed. It offered a panoramic view of the mountains, completely isolated from the standard state park campgrounds, where you could hear your neighbor's generator running until 10 at night. "We're cutting it close on daylight," David said, leaning forward over the steering wheel of his old forest green truck. The dashboard clock read 5:42 p.m. The sun was already dipping behind the western peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the gravel trail. "We've got an hour," I replied, checking the strapped-down gear in the rearview mirror. "Once we hit the clearing, it'll take 10 minutes to pitch the canvas tent. We'll have a fire going before the stars are even out." The truck bumped over a washed-out culvert, the suspension groaning. The trees out here were old-growth Douglas firs, their trunks massive and dark, spaced out like the pillars of an empty cathedral. As the road climbed higher, the brush grew thicker, crowding the sides of the truck, the stiff branches of salal and huckleberry scraping against the passenger door with a sound like dry fingernails on cardboard. When we finally reached the log landing, the engine died with a low sputter, and the sudden absence of the motor roar was deafening. We stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The wind was blowing up from the basin, carrying a sharp, cold scent of damp earth and pine resin. "Perfect," David muttered, walking to the edge of the clearing where the ground dropped off into a 300-foot ravine. He stood there for a moment, looking out over the endless sea of dark green trees below. Not another soul for 20 miles. We worked in silence, a well-rehearsed routine. We unloaded the heavy canvas wall tent, drove the thick iron stakes into the rocky soil, and set up our cots. By the time the sky had turned from a deep indigo to a bruised black, we had a small, efficient fire crackling in the pit we'd lined with river stones. The smell of frying bacon and coffee began to drift through the clearing, cutting through the damp chill of the night. It was around 9 o'clock when I noticed the first detail that felt slightly out of alignment. I had walked about 20 feet from the fire toward the back of the truck to grab the water jug. As I reached into the truck bed, my boot struck something metallic in the grass. I clicked on my headlamp and aimed the beam down. It wasn't a piece of logging debris. It was a small rusted tin can, completely empty, sitting upright on a flat stone. Beside it was another one, and another. There were 5 cans in total, arranged in a neat straight line facing our campsite. They weren't old enough to be from the logging era. The metal was tarnished, but the labels, generic brand pork and beans, were still partially legible, though bleached white by the sun and rain. "Hey David," I called out, keeping my voice low. It looked like we weren't the first ones to use the spot this summer. David walked over, holding his tin cup of coffee. He looked down at the line of cans, then knelt on one knee to inspect them. He tipped one over with his finger. A small pool of murky rainwater spilled out, along with a few dead earwigs. "Hunter, probably," David said, shrugging. "Though it's a weird place to leave them. Usually people toss them in the brush or burn them. Leaving them lined up like soldiers on a rock is a bit meticulous." "Yeah," I said, looking into the dark tree line just 10 feet beyond the truck. "Meticulous is the word." We went back to the fire, but the atmosphere had shifted, if only by a fraction. The wilderness feels different when you think you're the author of your own isolation, compared to when you find proof that someone else had already written a chapter in the same exact spot. By 11, the fire had burned down to a mound of glowing red embers. The wind had died completely, leaving the air brittle and cold. We crawled into our sleeping bags, the heavy canvas of the tent providing a comforting barrier against the dark. I pulled the wool blanket up over my shoulders and closed my eyes, listening to the rhythmic, heavy breathing of David on the cot across from me. He was already asleep. I shifted, trying to find a comfortable position on the canvas cot, when I heard it. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a faint, low-frequency hum. I sat up, the nylon of my sleeping bag rustling loud in the quiet tent. I froze, holding my breath to listen. The sound wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from inside the tent, or rather, from the table between our cots. I reached out into the dark, my fingers searching the wooden camp table until they brushed against the cold plastic casing of our emergency weather radio. It was an old battery-operated Midland radio we always brought along to track afternoon thunderstorms or high wind warnings on the ridges. The radio was turned off. The dial was firmly clicked to the off position, but as I lifted it to my ear, I could hear a faint rhythmic pulse coming from the small internal speaker. It wasn't static. It sounded like a sequence of short, sharp clicks, followed by a 2-second pause, then 3 more clicks. I clicked the power knob. The screen illuminated with a faint green backlight, displaying the channel numbers. The speaker immediately erupted into a harsh, roaring hiss of white noise. I turned the volume down hastily, not wanting to wake David, and turned the dial through the frequencies. Every single weather band was dead static. We were too deep in the shadow of the ridge to catch the automated NOAA broadcasts from the valley. I clicked the radio back to off. The green light died, but the faint rhythmic ticking from the speaker didn't stop. I pulled the battery cover off the back, pulled out the 3 AA batteries and sat them on the table. The ticking finally ceased. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. I lay back down, telling myself it was just a faulty capacitor in an old piece of electronics. A bit of a residual current discharging through the wiring, but I couldn't shake the image of those 5 tin cans sitting outside in the dark, lined up on the stone. An hour later, the second sound arrived. This one didn't come from the radio. It came from the deep V-shaped draw behind our tent, the steep ravine that plummeted down into the creek bed below. It was the sound of a stone sliding down a rocky slope. In the woods, rocks don't move on their own. Freezing temperatures can break shell loose, but tonight was cold, not freezing. A deer or elk could have stepped on a loose ledge, but an animal that large makes noise before and after the rock falls. You hear the brush break, the heavy thud of hooves on soil, and a snort of breath. This was just a single, heavy stone, dislodged from the upper lip of the ravine, rolling 20 feet down into the brush before stopping. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes wide in the pitch blackness of the tent. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. The forest remained dead silent. Just as my muscles began to relax, another sound rose from the bottom of the draw. It was a voice. It was too distant to make out individual words, but it was unmistakably human. It had the distinct rising and falling cadence of someone speaking into a telephone, or perhaps 2 people having a conversation at a normal volume, just out of earshot. It was a monotonous, flat murmur. The syllables drifted up through the trees, muffled by the distance and the thick canopy before dying out. I reached across the gap between our cots and shook David's shoulder. He woke with a sharp intake of breath, his hand instinctively going toward the flashlight by his pillow. "Don't turn it on," I whispered sharply. "Just listen." David went still. For 30 seconds, there's nothing but the sound of our own shallow breathing. Then, from the draw, a voice returned. This time, it was slightly clearer, as if whoever was speaking had climbed a few feet higher up the steep slope. 12. Orange. Check the line. 12. It was a man's voice. It wasn't angry or frightened, or calling for help. It sounded entirely casual, like a technician talking to a coworker while working on a piece of machinery. David leaned over, his face close to mine in the dark. "Is that a radio?" he whispered. "No," I said. "The weather radio is dead. The batteries are out. That's coming from the creek bed." "There's no trail down there," David muttered, his voice tightening. "It's all Devil's Club and fallen timber." "It's all Devil's Club and fallen timber. You can't walk down there in the daytime without an axe, let alone at midnight." We lay there for another 20 minutes, listening to the occasional fragment of speech drift up from the dark ravine. It never came any closer, but it never stopped. It was always the same flat conversational tone, separated by long intervals of silence and the distinct sound of small rocks being displaced on the hillside. Around 3 a.m, the temperature plummeted. A thick mountain fog rolled over the ridge, and the voice vanished entirely into the mist. The morning did what mornings always do in the woods. It made the terrors of the night seem foolish and small. The sun broke through the fog around 7, burning away the gray tendrils of mist and bathing the clearing in bright golden light. We stood outside the tent drinking black coffee that tasted like metal and wood smoke. We looked over the edge of the ravine. In the daylight, the slope looked nearly vertical, a treacherous tangle of rotting logs, jagged shale, and thick patches of thorny briars. "See," David said, pointing a finger down into the brush. "Nobody was climbing around down there last night. It's a cliff. The sound must have traveled up from the main road." Sound does strange things on these ridges. It bounces off rock faces. There was probably a couple of teenagers drinking beers 3 miles away at the crossroads, and the topography just tunneled the audio straight towards our tent. "Maybe," I said. I wanted to believe him. It was a logical explanation. Acoustics in the mountainous terrain are notorious for creating auditory illusions. But then I walked over to the truck to check the tires before we headed out to the creek for our first day of fishing. The 5 tin cans were gone from the rock. In their place, sitting exactly where the center can had been, was a neat rectangle of bright yellow plastic. It was a 6-inch strip of flagging tape, the kind surveyors and loggers use to mark property boundaries or timber lines. It hadn't been blown there by the wind. It was weighted down on both ends by 2 small, jagged pieces of gray flint that hadn't been on the clearing floor the evening before. David walked over, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. He stopped when he saw the ribbon. As a surveyor, he spent his life dealing with flagging tape. He knew every color, every code, every standard practice used by the state and private timber companies. "Did you find this in the truck?" he asked, his voice losing its morning cheer. "No," I said. "It was right here. Someone took the cans and left this." David knelt down and picked up the yellow ribbon, turning it over in his fingers. There was no writing on it. It was clean, bright, and completely unweathered. It hadn't been sitting out in the rain for months. It was fresh. Yellow isn't used much in here. Yellow isn't used much out here anymore, David says softly, staring into the woods. The state uses pink or blue for timber sales. Private companies use orange for property lines. Yellow is usually reserved for hazard warnings or search and rescue grid boundaries. "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means someone was standing right here while we were sleeping," David said. He tossed the ribbon back onto the stone. "They stood 5 feet from the truck, took their garbage back, and left us a marker." We didn't go fishing that morning. The desire to sit by a creek with our backs turned to the forest had evaporated. Instead, we decided to do a loop around the clearing to see if we could find where whoever it was had come from. We found the trail 50 yards behind our campsite, hidden behind a screen of dense cedar saplings. It wasn't a recreational trail. It was an old packer's path, narrow and deeply rutted, that wound along the shoulder of the ridge, parallel to the ravine. As we walked down the path, David kept his eyes on the ground, looking for boot prints. The soil was damp from the night's fog, but the ground was covered in a thick carpet of pine needles that didn't retain sharp impressions. Every 20 or 30 yards, however, we found another piece of yellow flagging tape. They were tied to the branches at eye level. Not neatly knotted. but wrapped around the twigs twice and left to hang like small yellow tongues. "They're fresh," David whispered, touching one as we passed. "Look at its edges. They were torn off the roll recently. The plastic hasn't stretched or faded from the sun." The path led us about a half-mile down the ridge until we reached a small natural saddle where the terrain leveled out. In the center of the saddle stood an old abandoned Forest Service cabin. The roof had collapsed long ago under the weight of the winter snows, and cedar shakes rotted away to reveal the skeletal rafters beneath. The door was missing, leaving a dark rectangular void facing the trail. We stopped 20 feet away. The cabin felt dead, filled with a damp green smell of moss and decaying wood that had taken over the interior. "Let's go back," I said, my chest feeling tight. "This is stupid. We should just pack up and truck and find another ridge." "Wait," David said. He was staring at the cabin's front window frame, where the glass had been broken out decades ago. Tied to the windowsill was another strip of yellow ribbon, but this one wasn't empty. We stepped closer, our boots crunching softly on the forest floor. Written on the yellow plastic in thick, black permanent marker were a series of numbers and letters. 402-B/GP-9/03-24. David stared at the writing, his face completely blank. "What is it?" I asked. "A timber inventory?" "No," David said. His voice was barely a whisper, and when he looked at me, I saw a flicker of genuine unease in his eyes that I had never seen before. 402 is this road. B means the secondary spur. GP stands for ground party. And 03-24, that's a date, March 24th. "March of this year?" I asked. "That was 4 months ago." "David," I continued, "what does ground party mean?" "It's search and rescue notation," David said, his fingers tracing the rough log wall of the cabin. "When they're looking for someone who went missing in the backcountry, they split into teams. Ground Party 9 was assigned to this spur in March. I remember reading about it in the papers. A hiker went missing up here during the early spring blizzard. They found his car down at the highway gate, but they never found him. They called off the search after 6 days because the snow got too deep." I looked at the dark interior of the cabin. If the search was called off in March, why is this tape fresh? David didn't answer. He turned around and looked back down the trail towards our camp. The yellow ribbons we had followed were visible through the trees, a line of bright dots tracing a path directly to our clearing. We didn't stay to investigate the cabin. We turned around and walked back to our campsite, our pace increasing with every step until we were nearly jogging. The woods around us felt crowded, as if the space between the tree trunks had shrunk while we were gone. When we got back to the clearing, we began tearing down the camp with frantic efficiency. We didn't bother folding the canvas tent neatly. We threw it in the back of the truck in a heavy, disheveled heap. We dumped the water jug, tossed the cots on top of the canvas, and threw our bags into the cab. By 2 p.m, the truck was loaded. David climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine cranked. But it didn't catch. David frowned, pumping the gas pedal, and tried again. The starter moaned, a heavy mechanical struggle, but the engine remained dead. "Come on," David muttered, slamming his palm against the steering wheel. "You ran perfectly yesterday." He popped the hood, and we both stepped out to look inside. David wasn't a mechanic, but he knew the basics. He checked the battery terminals. They were clean and tight. He checked the oil, spark plug wires, and the air filter. Everything looked exactly as it should. There were no severed hoses, no signs of animal damage, no leaking fluids. "Try it again," I said, standing by the fender. David got back in and turned the key. The engine cranked, but there was no spark, no hint of combustion. It was just spinning air. "It's the fuel pump," David said, stepping out of the cab and wiping his greasy hands on a rag. His voice was flat, carrying the cold realization of our situation. "Or the distributor. Something internal failed. We're not driving out of here." I looked down the logging road. 20 miles of rough gravel sat between us and the nearest paved highway. On foot, carrying our gear, that was a 10-hour hike through steep terrain. If we started now, we'd be walking in the dark by the time we reached the halfway mark. And after the sounds from the night before, the idea of being caught on the open road after dark made my stomach turn. We stay here tonight, I said. We have water, we have food. Tomorrow morning at first light, we start walking down the road together. We leave the truck. David looked at the ridgeline, then nodded slowly. We keep the tent down, he said. We sleep in the cab of the truck. The doors lock. It's safer. We spent the remaining hours of daylight sitting in the cab of the truck. The windows rolled up an inch to let air in, but keeping the mountain chill out. The sun sank lower, casting that same bruised purple light across the clearing. The shadows of the trees stretched across the gravel road, slowly swallowing the truck in darkness. At 8:12 p.m., the radio on the dashboard clicked. It was the truck's factory stereo. The key wasn't in the ignition. The truck was completely off. The digital display on the dash didn't light up, but the 4 speakers in the doors let out a sudden sharp burst of static. David and I both jumped, our heads hitting the headliner. The static subsided, replacing itself with a low, thrumming hum. It was the exact same pitch as the weather radio from the night before. And then, through the speakers, a voice came through. It wasn't a broadcast. It was the same flat, conversational man's voice we had heard in the ravine. But it wasn't distant anymore. It sounded like he was sitting in the back seat, speaking directly into the back of our necks. Spoke to the supervisor. 42 miles. Copy that. 0303. David reached out with a trembling hand and turned the volume knob on the dash. It did nothing. The voice remained a steady, moderate volume, completely unbothered by the stereo controls. David, I whispered, my hand gripping the door handle. Put the key in. Turn it on. David shoved the key into the ignition and turned it into the accessory position. The dashboard lit up, the radio display flashing AM 1040, a dead local sports station from the valley. The voice instantly vanished, replaced by the normal roaring hiss of an untuned radio station. He turned the key back off and pulled it out. The stereo stayed alive. The static returned for a second, then settled back into a low rhythmic hum. Then the voice spoke again, but it didn't say the same words. It was different now. It sounded closer, the audio quality clearer, as if someone had adjusted a microphone. Subject identified. Logging landing 402. 2 individuals, stationary. David's breath hitched in his throat. He looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. That's us, he whispered. He's talking about us. Before I could answer, a sound echoed from outside the truck. It wasn't from the ravine this time. It came from the gravel road directly ahead of us, the only way out of the clearing. A footstep. A heavy, deliberate step on the gravel. David grabbed the flashlight from the seat, clicked it on, and aimed the beam through the windshield, illuminating the road ahead. The high beams of the truck weren't on, but the flashlight beam was strong enough to cut through the dark for about 30 yards. The road was empty. There was nothing but gray gravel, the wild blackberry bushes, and a dark wall of forest. Another step. It sounded like it was 15 feet closer now, right on the edge of the light's reach. But there was nothing there. The gravel didn't shift. The bushes didn't move. It was just a sound, sharp and clear, isolated from any physical presence. Closing the perimeter, 12 minutes. Check the line, the truck speakers murmured. The voice completely calm, completely professional. Then, from the dark woods to our left, another sound started. It was the sound of a plastic roll being pulled apart. It was the unmistakable sound of someone pulling a long strip of flagging tape over a plastic dispenser. David swept the flashlight beam to the left window. The light illuminated a thicker cedar branch just 5 feet away. As we watched, a piece of bright yellow flagging tape appeared on the branch. It didn't drop from above. It didn't get tied by a hand. The yellow plastic simply materialized, wrapping itself around the green cedar needles, twisting twice, and hanging down into the air, bright and clean under the beam of the flashlight. Marker set. Log landing clear. Verify grid line, the radio said. The footstep was right outside the truck door now. The gravel directly beneath the driver's side mirror crunched down, as if a heavy weight had been placed upon it. The truck's suspension dipped slightly to the left, the frame groaning under the invisible load. David let out a choked sob, pulling his legs up onto his seat and pressing his back against the passenger door. I grabbed the iron tire that we had kept on the floorboards, holding it against my chest, my knuckles turning white. The driver's side window began to fog up, not from the mountain air, but from the inside out, a thick circular patch of condensation appearing on the glass, right at eye level, as if someone was standing on that gravel outside, leaning their face against the window, breathing slowly against the pane. Inside the cab, the air became freezing cold. Our breath turned to white plumes in the beam of the flashlight. The radio speakers let out one final, long blast of static, a screeching, electronic howl that filled the small cabin until my ears began to ring. And then, through the noise, the man's voice spoke one last time. It didn't sound like a radio transmission anymore. It had the clear, resonant tone of someone speaking in an empty room. Search concluded. No survivors located. Clear the ridge. The radio went dead. The digital display on the dashboard flashed once, then went dark. Outside, the suspension of the truck creaked as the weight was lifted from the running board. The sound of heavy footsteps began to walk away, moving down the gravel road, regular and slow, fading into the distance until they were completely gone. We didn't sleep. We sat in the center of the cab, pressed against each other, staring out the window until the sky turned from black to pale, cold gray. When the sun finally cleared the eastern mountains, illuminating the clearing with ordinary yellow light, we didn't check the engine. We didn't grab our bags. We opened the truck doors, stepped out into the gravel, and began walking down Ridge Road 402. We didn't look back at the truck. We didn't look at the ravine. We just walked down the center of the road, our eyes fixed on the gravel directly in front of our boots. Every 50 yards, all the way down the mountain, a strip of yellow flagging tape was tied to the trees. They marked our progress, a perfect line of yellow dots leading us down from the high country. We followed them for 15 miles until we finally reached the main state highway gate around 4 in the afternoon. A passing motorist saw us, two sunburnt, hollow-eyed men walking down the shoulder of the road, nothing but a tire iron, and pulled over to help. They drove us to the nearest Forest Service station in the town of Morton. The rangers were polite, but we could see the skepticism in their eyes as we told them our story. They wrote everything down on a standard incident report, nodding along. David described the radio interference and the yellow tape. Sounds like you boys had to run in with some rogue loggers or maybe some squatters living up in old spurs, the head ranger said, pouring us a cup of water. They use those radios to coordinate timber theft sometimes. And the flagging tape? Well, like you said, the ridges are covered in old markers. What about Ground Party 9? David asked, his voice raw. The missing hiker from March. The ranger paused, his pen hovering over the paper. He looked at David for a long moment before speaking. We did have our search up there in March, the ranger said carefully. A young guy from Seattle. His car was found by the gate, but Ground Party 9 wasn't the team we deployed. Why not, I asked. Because we only have 6 search teams in the district, the ranger replied, leaning back in his chair. We don't have a Party 9, never have, and the search wasn't called off because of the snow. We found his gear 3 days into the search. It was sitting in an old cabin up on the saddle. Did you find him? David asked. The ranger shook his head, looking down at his desk. No, just his boots, his backpack and emergency radio. The radio was clicked to the off position, but the boys who recovered it said that the internal speaker was making a strange ticking sound. They couldn't get it to stop until they smashed it with an axe. David and I didn't say anything else. We signed the report, took the bus back to the city, and went back to our lives. David sold his truck 3 weeks later to a scrapyard 2 counties away. He told me he couldn't stand the smell of the interior anymore, that it smelled like damp moss and cedar, no matter how many times he detailed it. I don't go camping anymore. I stay in the city, where the lights are bright and the noise of traffic fills the night. But sometimes during the wet winter months, when the power goes out in the apartment building and the rooms go completely dark, I find myself standing by the window. And if the streetlight below was quiet enough and I listened closely to the silence of the room, I can still hear it coming from a small battery-operated clock on my nightstand. Tick, 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 tick. A faint rhythmic pulse waiting for the line to open.